U.S. president has threatened land attacks on Venezuela. The Venezuelan government hopes he's bluffing.
It's well known that Trump is not keen on boots on the ground. He's not keen on invasions that might lead to an open-ended military commitment.
I'm Carolyn Beeler, today making sense of the posturing between the U.S. and Venezuela. And in Haiti, it is rival factions and police forces that are fighting.
The civilian population is in the middle.
A new loss leaves them without emergency health care. Plus, he was a treasure trove of pithy quotes.
I find that alcohol taken in sufficient quantities can produce all the effects of drunkenness.
But Oscar Wilde didn't have a library card. And some helpful reassurances from a walk across the globe.
The world is still the world, and people are still people.
Those stories and more on The World. This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. Thanks for coming along this Thursday. Covert operations are, by definition, shadowy affairs. But yesterday, President Trump stood in front of cameras in the Oval Office and confirmed something that is usually kept under wraps.
Why did you authorize the CIA to go into Venezuela? And is there more information you can share about these strikes on the alleged...
Well, I can't do that, but I authorized for two reasons, really.
Two keywords there, I authorized. Trump went on to say the White House was weighing the possibility of a land attack on Venezuela. It is no secret that the U.S. has deployed multiple warships to the southern Caribbean. The Pentagon has carried out at least 5 strikes on boats suspected of carrying narcotics off the Venezuelan coast in recent weeks, killing an estimated 27 people. The latest attack took place on Tuesday, Trump said. Phil Gunson is a senior analyst with Crisis Group, and he joined us from Caracas to discuss the escalating situation. Phil, are people there talking about this statement from Trump, and what are they saying?
Well, yes, people are, but there's a lot of confusion here, lack of information. Of course, Venezuela is a country where the mass media are all in the hands of the government or not able really to speak freely about these things. So whilst there's a group of people or a percentage of the population, let's say, that are clearly rubbing their hands in anticipation of some kind of U.S. intervention, and another group on the other end of the spectrum who are fearful of what may happen, I think most people in the middle are asking the same questions you are. What does it all mean?
All right, so let's break down those two sides that you just talked about. The people who are potentially hopeful, are those hoping that Trump will somehow overthrow Maduro?
Yeah, I mean, very large numbers of people, a majority of the population want to see change here. And change clearly means seeing the back of Maduro. How many, what percentage of those would actually be keen to see it come about thanks to force of arms, particularly by means of a foreign intervention? It's hard to say, but I think a lot of people would be in the category of, well, if it's quick and it brings about change, then let's go for it.
And what about those on the other side of the spectrum?
Well, from the point of view of the government, obviously, this is existential. You know, if there is a U.S. intervention, if there's no agreement with the current incumbent, with Nicolas Maduro and the people around him, then those people are well aware that they may end up in jail or even worse. Even those further down the tree, if you like, the people in middle-ranking bureaucracy, people in the military, people who've been associated with the government over these years, are fearful not just of losing their jobs, but of possibly, suffering revenge attacks by people who've been building up resentments over the last quarter century.
I want to play a clip that Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro, said on national TV last night addressing this new threat from Trump.
¿Hasta cuándo golpes de Estado él hacía? América Latina no los quiere.
He's saying here, how long will these CIA coups continue? Latin America doesn't want them, doesn't need them, and rejects them. Is there any way to know, Phil, exactly how President Nicolas Maduro sees these threats and how seriously he is taking them?
Well, it's very difficult to be certain, but people that I talk to who claim to know what the feeling is inside the government say that they're really fairly convinced that they can stick it out. They feel that Trump is bluffing. They feel that he's not, it's well known that Trump is not keen on boots on the ground. He's not keen on invasions that might lead to an open-ended military commitment on the part of the U.S.
Now, yesterday in the Oval Office, President Trump said that he, quote, thinks Venezuela is feeling heat. How do you interpret that comment?
I think it's optimistic on the part of Trump. I think that what he's hoping is that finally maximum pressure, which has really been cranked up to unprecedented levels, may produce the results that he's looking for. Maduro appears to have offered almost everything short of leaving power. And so it seems that for the US administration that they're not going to call off the fleet until and unless Maduro leaves. But of course, it can't stay there indefinitely. So unless they're prepared to do something more than blowing a few things up, unless they're prepared to make an actual military incursion and also to guarantee the stability and the survival of any government that replaces Maduro, then it's hard to see how they can achieve their objective.
Does that mean that you do not think that Venezuela is feeling the heat, as President Trump has assessed?
The calculation remains that even if the heat is turned up still further, leaving is so dangerous that it's better to stick it out.
Do these sorts of pronouncements by the White House run the risk of backfiring and actually unifying Maduro's base?
I think that's already happened to an extent. I think the idea that if the more pressure you apply, the more it is likely that the government will break or that the military will split. I think that may be a misapprehension. It seems to me that in reality, what happens with external pressure is that it forces them closer together because they know that, in the famous phrase, if they don't hang together, they'll hang separately. This kind of saber rattling, these kind of threats run the risk of losing credibility. I mean, the idea that you can continue forever threatening without actually producing the action that you're suggesting you're about to do, I think that's, again, it's a mistaken approach.
The CIA has a long history of covert operations in Latin America that have not gone well. How do you see that track record informing people's perspectives right now?
Yes, that's certainly true. I mean, a lot of people here are saying, well, the CIA is going to be deployed in Venezuela. When did they ever actually leave? Because everybody's always assumed that there must be some people on the ground here who are feeding intelligence back to the US. I think the interpretation at the moment is that we have to see this as part of the rhetoric rather than a serious attempt. If the idea really is to overthrow Maduro, then you need military force, and that can either come from inside in the form of the Venezuelan armed forces, or it can come from the US. But secret agents on their own won't be able to do it.
Phil Gunson is a senior analyst with Crisis Group. He spoke to us from Caracas about escalating U.S.-Venezuela tensions. In Venice, La Fenice Theater is one of Italy's most famous opera venues. It's home to a world-class orchestra, and tomorrow night the theater should have a packed house. On La Fenice's calendar is a performance of Alban Berg's Wojciech. But instead, the theater will be quiet tomorrow because the musicians are refusing to perform. The World's Bianca Hillier explains.
Leaders at the Opera House announced a new conductor a few weeks ago. Her name is Beatrice Venezzi, and she most recently served as the principal guest conductor at the Teatro Colón in Argentina. But in her home country of Italy, the general population may know her best from television commercials.
L'eccellenza è una ricerca continua.
Da Bioscalin, l'attivatore capillare.
Venezzi has done a number of ads, including one for a hair product and another for a brand of pasta. The marketing slogan for that one was, "Not your average pasta and not your average conductor."
As a conductor, it's my job to draw out the very best of every member of the orchestra. I just have to convince them to follow me.
But therein lies the problem. Staff members at Venezzi's new theater, La Fenice in Venice, are refusing to follow her. Tomorrow night, they're going on strike, asking for Venezzi to be removed from her new position. For one thing, they say she doesn't have the resume for the job.
Mi sento umiliata. Io vorrei avere come direttore, come guida, una persona.
Standing outside the theater last week, one member of the orchestra told Italian media that she feels humiliated to have such an inadequate conductor take the helm. Others have pointed to Venezzi's age. She's 35 years old, which is relatively young for conductors at major opera houses.
L'orchestra e il teatro La Fenice necessiti di un direttore di pari livello.
Marco Trentin, a cellist in the orchestra, tells me that La Fenice often collaborates with conductors who work at the world's most prestigious opera houses, like La Scala in Milan. Venezia, he adds, will need to have a long career before being at that level. Others say it's not about her age, it's about her lack of skill.
She's 35, she's not a baby.
Stefano Arezzi is a musicologist from Italy and now lives in Norway.
I can make you examples like Niccolò Foron, this German-Italian very young composer. But he has a technique that is, my God, sublime. And Mozart was conducting concerts at the age of 14. Are we kidding?
Arezzi says while Venezia's skills are subpar, another glaring concern is how she was appointed to lead the Venice Orchestra. Usually, a candidate would meet with the choir and musicians ahead of time, he says. In this case, there was no consultation.
It's a long procedure that was not done.
Critics say that streamlined process could be because Venezia has friends in high places. Her father once held a regional leadership role in a neo-fascist political party, and Venezia herself has been embraced by the far-right party Brothers of Italy, headed by Giorgia Meloni.
Grazie.
In 2022, Venezia gave a speech at the party's conference.
In questo consesso ringrazio Giorgia Meloni per l'invito che mi ha rivolto.
And she thanked Meloni for the invitation. Later that year, Meloni became Italy's prime minister, and Venezia was named the government's official music advisor. A number of officials have stepped in to defend Venezia over the past few weeks, including the country's culture minister, Alessandro Giuli. He called Venezia an excellent artist and said the orchestra's complaints are unjustified. Venezia did not reply to an interview request for this story, and the press office for the theater, La Fenice, sent me a short statement saying they hope the situation will tone down so everyone can find a way to work together. But the head of the theater, Nicola Colabianchi, did speak to Italy's Channel 7 for an interview. He said appointing Venezia was a choice based on musical content and marketing, adding that the decision will not be reconsidered. Still, the musicians will try. Cellist Marco Trentin says he doesn't know what's going to happen after tomorrow's strike, but he says the theater's staff members are determined to carry on the battle. And nearly 16,000 members of the public have signed a petition online supporting their fight. For The World, I'm Bianca Hillier.
The late Oscar Wilde was a man of many talents. The Irish author wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray and The Importance of Being Earnest, and he was once the toast of London society. You may have seen some of his pithy quotes online.
I find that alcohol taken in sufficient quantities can produce all the effects of drunkenness.
An optimist will tell you the glass is half full, the pessimist half empty, and the engineer will tell you the glass is twice the size it needs to be.
I can believe in anything provided it's incredible. That's why I intend to die a Catholic, though I couldn't possibly live as one. Catholicism is such a romantic religion. It has saints and sinners. The Church of England only has respectable people who believe in respectability.
Wilde's lack of what the era saw as respectability got him into trouble. He was sent to jail 130 years ago for the crime of gross indecency, essentially not being straight. The 1895 trial has been dramatized in many movies.
Oscar Wilde, the crime of which you have been convicted is so bad that I shall pass the severest sentence that the law will allow. It is the worst case I have ever tried.
One lesser-known part of his punishment, not dramatic enough for the movies, is that Wilde got his library card revoked. At the time, it was called a reader pass, and for a literary type, that is rough. Well, this week, Wilde posthumously gets his pass reinstated. His grandson, Merlin Holland, will collect it on his behalf. And considering that the British Library now brags about its collection of Wilde manuscripts, including drafts of his major plays, seems like a library card is only fair, even if he cannot use it. This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. There are aid groups that are experts in providing essential services in some of the most violent places on the planet. But even for them, some places are just too dangerous. Coming up, we look at what that means for people in peril. You're listening to The World. This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. Doctors Without Borders, or MSF, has permanently closed its emergency care center in Port-au-Prince. The humanitarian organization said yesterday that the decision was due to increasing insecurity in the Haitian capital. The center's operations had been on pause since March, but the facility has widely been seen as a lifeline in a city that's come almost completely under gang control. And the announcement of its permanent closure suggests a less than optimistic outlook. Diana Mania Arroyo is MSF's country director for Haiti. She spoke to us today from Port-au-Prince to explain.
There has been very active conflict, not only in the last few weeks, but in the last few months. And this is something we experienced firsthand in March 2025, when a convoy of our organization received at least 15 bullets. So this comes at a time when there is very active conflict between armed groups in the area and between police forces. So the challenging aspect of all of this is that the civilian population is in the middle, that experiences violence every day, and that now has even more limited access to healthcare.
What kind of care do people receive at this center, and what are the options available to them now that it is closed?
The facility is an emergency center, so we had a lot of patients that had been in accidents. We had a lot of patients with other emergency complications, and there were also some that had been hit by a bullet. The health facility is in downtown Port-au-Prince, where currently there is not only an absence of a health facility where people can access care that is free of charge. We are the only actor that provides healthcare that is free of charge.
In all of Port-au-Prince?
In all of Port-au-Prince. And it is also an area where there's a lot of displacement caused by the violence in these areas. So this population, if they can afford it, they can take a motorcycle or public transport to the single public hospital that still functions in Delma 33, that's called Hôpital de la Paix. Or they can travel to Tabar, our other emergency hospital, for trauma and for burns. But there's very specific admission criteria for this other hospital that is also extremely busy. Mm-hmm. So people have very limited options, whether to go to a private structure if they can afford it, or nothing at all.
I'm curious a bit more broadly how MSF makes its decisions about which places are too risky to operate, because I know that MSF is still operating in, for example, Gaza. Mm-hmm. Can you walk me through the factors that are weighed when deciding whether to discontinue operations in a place that is dangerous?
So the building, as I said before, has been hit multiple times by stray bullets. And at that point, there were a number of reinforcements that were done. For example, installing certain metallic plates in areas where, for example, the cars were parked or the ambulances were parked to protect the teams from stray bullets. But since March, conflict has intensified significantly, not only in the sense of clashes between armed groups and the police, but also in the shape of drone explosions. We understand that access to care in this area is critical. There's been various analysis and specifically technical ballistic protection assessments to identify solutions to protect the personnel and the patients inside this structure. But unfortunately, there's not been any suitable solution so far.
There's no way to fully protect staff or patients in that facility.
Yes. The location of the hospital and the location of the clashes makes it very difficult to protect it.
So what do you expect that the impact will be on the local community that might have otherwise gotten care at this facility?
Well, there's already been a negative impact since March. Because since March, this population has not been able to access medical care that they were able to access before free of charge. So some of them are potentially going to one of the private clinics in other parts of the city or to the one public hospital. But we are conscious that this translates into further limiting access to care to the population.
Diana Mania Arroyo of Doctors Without Borders is the country director for Haiti. head of MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence service, does not spend much time in the limelight, so Ken McCallum's public appearance today to deliver his annual intelligence update would have gotten a lot of attention no matter what. But in his remarks, he expressed frustration over the failed prosecution of 2 British men accused of spying for China, which makes this year's speech really big news. The World's Matthew Bell has more.
The Director General of MI5, which is similar to the FBI here in the United States, says the national security threats currently facing the United Kingdom are evolving.
In 2025, a more hostile world is forcing the biggest shifts in MI5's mission since 9/11.
Ken McCallum said his teams are working as hard as ever against terrorism, but in this new era, what he called state threats are escalating.
In the last year, we've seen a 35% increase in the number of individuals we're investigating for involvement in state threat activity. That means espionage, including against our parliament, our universities, our critical infrastructure. But now, states are also consistently descending into ugly methods MI5 is more used to seeing in our terrorism casework.
McCallum said MI5 is routinely uncovering attempts to carry out acts of surveillance, sabotage, arson, or physical violence, all on UK soil, but he did not break down which foreign governments were behind the increase.
We're dealing with these threats every day.
McCallum was asked specifically about China, and he said Chinese state actors do pose a national security threat to Britain, quote, every day. The head of MI5 also told journalists that he is frustrated when opportunities to prosecute national security threatening activity are not followed through for whatever reason. Those comments are sure to bring even more attention to the case of Christopher Berry and Christopher Cash. They're the 2 British men accused of spying for China between 2021 and 2023. They deny the charges, and prosecutors unexpectedly dropped the case against them last month. But there are still lots of questions about why.
The decision to drop the case just weeks before the trial of Christopher Berry and Christopher Cash was due to begin now seems even more baffling.
That's commentator Stephen Sacker speaking on Times Radio. He said the public interest would have been served better if that case were put before a judge and a jury.
As it is, we have a legal mess which leaves the impression the government would very much like to avoid embarrassing scrutiny of Chinese spying amid a concerted effort to deepen economic ties. Is China's money really worth the cost?
The Chinese embassy in the UK says the charges against Berry and Cash were fabricated and amount to malicious slander. For his part, Spy Chief Ken McCallum today acknowledged that UK relations with China are complex. But MI5's role is not, he said. It's focused on dealing with threats to national security. For The World, I'm Matthew Bell.
Just ahead, what happens when militants get traction on social issues. We look at a chapter of recent history when Quebec had to pull itself back from the grip of political violence. That's next. You're listening to The World. This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. Canada's French-speaking province, Quebec, has seriously taken up the question of seceding from the rest of Canada. That conversation goes back to the 1960s, when tensions between wealthy English and poor French neighborhoods in the province turned violent. A lot of that was driven by a group of militant French-speaking separatists called the Front de Libération de Québec, or the FLQ. The FLQ planted bombs and took hostages. The federal government responded by deploying the military on the streets. It all culminated in what is known as the October Crisis in 1970. Our colleagues at the PRX National Security podcast, Things That Go Boom, looked at how Quebec pulled itself back from political violence 55 years ago and what we can learn from it today. Host Lacey Healy and producer Katie Toth have the story.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Boom producer Katie Toth is on our way to meet Chris Oliveros. He's a famous graphic novelist in Montreal, and he wrote this book on the FLQ. But Katie's stuck. She's stopped by the warning bells of a train track that have been going off for a good half an hour or so, with no way to cross.
The train passes. I meet Chris.
Hi, good to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thanks
Sorry
for
you had that
time.
trouble over there.
He points to the water beside us and explains there's a reason why the trains are down here.
Up until 1971, the big ships, like the huge ships, would have gone through the canal, and that was the main source of transport, essentially, for so much industry.
The ships and the train tracks met right here in this working-class neighborhood of Saint-Henri, where factory after factory loaded and unloaded goods along the water.
And then in these neighborhoods like Saint-Henri, you would have the workers living close by. And then, so all these were very poor neighborhoods. And again, it was mostly Francophone, and the workers would come to work in the factories.
We've come down here to see one spot in front of one factory in particular. He drew it for his book. It's a very simple painting in white of a human head and torso, with no arms and no legs.
To commemorate exactly where this poor 16-year-old named Jean Corbeau blew himself up by accident.
Corbeau was going to plant a makeshift bomb outside the factory. These things were not very stable.
It blew up in his hands and it killed him instantly. So you can see this photo shows this side of the wall and like the windows are all blown out.
Lacey Healy here. I just want to jump in real quick because when most people think about the FLQ crisis in Canada, if they think about it or know about it at all, they think about this frenzied month in October of 1970, where Quebec separatists kidnapped a cabinet minister named Pierre Laporte and a British trade diplomat named James Cross. The separatists got their manifesto read on the national broadcaster, killed one of their hostages, and then fled to Cuba. At this time, the streets were full of cops and military servicemen, and the government responded by cracking down on leftists and separatists for years, leading to a long-standing debate in the country about whether the prime minister at the time, Pierre Trudeau, took his response too far. Chris tells Katie that this is what he was going to write about. At least, that's what he thought.
But as soon as I started doing my research, I realized that there's so much in here that's completely fascinating and mostly forgotten.
And one thing that's often forgotten was how amateur it all was.
It was all amateur hour. The funny thing about the FLQ is that there were sort of different waves. What would happen is that the first wave, they would have their plans would get foiled, they would be stopped by the police and thrown in jail. And then maybe a year later, a completely different cell would spring up, like completely unconnected, and they would have their crazy plans.
Crazy plans concocted by angry, idealistic, middle-aged men who pulled in kids looking to believe in something. Like in the first wave, 1963. Recruiters went to a local Italian spot and asked a bunch of teens if they had access to a secret hideout, had any firearms, and were willing to die for the cause. Then in the second wave, 1964, a Hungarian immigrant tried to make a camp for guerrilla fighters in the Quebec countryside, thinking they would go head-to-head with the Canadian military. They had 12 people already. He got only 2 new recruits. In the third wave, the Marxist, anti-ruling class vibe that had been percolating became way more explicit, and the separatists started targeting sites of exchange and industry, like the Montreal Stock Exchange in 1969, and just a few years earlier, the factory where we saw the end of 16-year-old Jean Corbeau.
Throughout the 7 years of the FLQ from 1963 to 1970, the authorities, meaning like the government and the police and the RCMP and so on, never quite knew how many people were involved. And at one point, they thought there could potentially be thousands, literally thousands of people involved in this movement. Now, the funny thing is that after everything was said and done, it turns out that with each of these different waves, there were never more than a dozen or two. Literally, there were, at the height of this movement, there were maybe 12 or 14 people involved. You would always have, almost always have, really small groups of people that could actually create a lot of havoc.
That havoc is something Liz Morgan experienced firsthand.
We had a beautiful house. It was built by my grandfather, and it had a
bird tower for, what were they called, the pigeons? The white, beautiful fantail pigeons. They had been there for 100 years, I guess, by then. We woke up one morning, their necks had all been strangled, and somebody had gone up in the tower and just killed them all.
Today, Liz Morgan lives a short drive from that beautiful house she grew up in. She runs an organic farm outside of Montreal. But Liz is also the product of a department store empire. She's standing in front of the flagship store that belonged to her family, Morgan's, before the chain was sold to Hudson's Bay Company in 1960. When Liz was a kid in her 20s, Montreal was a city with a lot of riz.
The futuristic shapes of the pavilions were rising against the sky. The sharp thrusting lines of the A-shaped steel pavilion as well.
The International and Universal Exposition, or Expo, had just come through in 1967. The city was building a huge subway system, which would become a point of pride for decades. And that subway was also a constant source of supply for the FLQ because there was dynamite all over town that wasn't locked up. And maybe that gets at the crux of what was happening here a bit. This was the city where you wanted to be. It was also a site of radical politics and big social changes. Quebec was moving away from the church. It was building a social welfare system. And Montreal was home to increasingly militant tactics that put a target on Liz's back. The FLQ had specifically named her family as the kind of Anglophones they would be making an example of.
I felt, because my mother was French-Canadian, that I had French blood in me, that we would be immune. Obviously not. So the family got together and told my brother and I that if we were kidnapped, the policy was not to pay rewards.
We walk over to the old mall where at one point, Liz even found herself being followed.
So I left through a back door and I was like feeling like I was in a spy movie or something, but got into my car and started heading home and felt that I was being followed by cars. Anyway, I went through back streets of Westmount over the mountain, and I think I lost them.
To Liz, it seemed clear. Someone was out there taking some legitimate grievances and torquing those grievances to send a dangerous message.
You know, it was understandable that there was a feeling against the English, and it just somehow wasn't resolved. But as in any case of violence, it's usually propagated by not the people who have started the questioning. It's the thugs that join any peaceful demonstration or protest that warp the true meaning of what's being tried.
The FLQ argued that violent action was the only solution. They saw Quebec's future in socialism, and they thought that the only way that Quebec could get to socialism was without English Canada on its back. But while the FLQ was regrouping for its third most violent wave, others in the community were asking how to make change at the ballot box.
It's about time we make up our minds. There's been a continuing crisis about the status of Quebec and about where the hell we go from there.
Let me bring you to 1968, when an edgy young statesman, René Lévesque, starts the Parti Québécois. This is the moment that eventually will create another option for Quebec, a path out of crisis. 2 years later, Lévesque's party is up and running for its first provincial election. In this clip, you can hear that he's pretty nervous. He isn't so sure how he'll fare with the electoral system.
It could be a huge popular vote and not enough seats, which would be dangerous because this creates a sort of frustration.
And that's exactly what happened in 1970. The Parti Québécois got only 7 of the province's 125 seats, despite having more than 20% of the vote. FLQ militants, they turned around and said, look, this is proof. Democracy doesn't work.
Public sympathy was growing from the early 60s up until 1970, and it culminated in what happened in October 1970.
So after 8 years of failed attempts at revolution, the FLQ goes big. Political kidnappings.
They were actually directly influenced by revolutionary movements in South America, in particular in Brazil and Uruguay and in Argentina.
The FLQ captures 2 people at gunpoint. a British trade diplomat, and the popular Quebec minister, Pierre Laporte. The FLQ started negotiating for their statements to be read on public television and for free passage to Cuba. And then, somewhere along the way, one of their hostages, Pierre Laporte, was strangled by the chain around his neck.
It's unclear whether he was strangled while he broke the window, tried to escape, and maybe he kind of like his chain got stuck, or his captors actually decided to kill him. It's also unclear because his captors made a pact amongst themselves. When they were questioned, okay, which one of you did it? They said, we all did it. There's one of them who's still alive, but to this day, he's still not revealing what exactly happened.
That moment, it completely changed how people saw the FLQ.
There was shock and horror and revulsion, and people all of a sudden didn't want to support that. The objectives were still there. They still wanted to change this oppressive system, but not by means of violence.
Alexandre Turgeon, a historian at Laval University in Quebec, agrees. And he says that when Quebec recoiled from violence, they still had somewhere else to go, a political route. Stuff like protesting, marching in the street, and, yes, voting.
On the one hand, you had the FLQ choosing political violence to achieve their goal. But at the same time, you had Parti Québécois, a political party founded on the idea that independence was to be achieved, was to be reached through democratic means, through democracy, through a referendum. So it was a very young party that could have been wiped out right there because of the October crisis. But at the end of the day, Quebecers, they went not for the political violence option, but for the democratic option.
Quebec still has one of the country's biggest social safety nets. Free or cheap college, depending on what you study, more social assistance than the other big provinces for people with disabilities. The leftists made a mark. To be fair, Alexander doesn't want to simplify this too much. After the October crisis, the state's crackdown on political activists, even peaceful ones, were intense.
I would not say that FLQ helped the cause. In a way, it did quite the opposite.
Canadian National Police continued to follow and surveil Quebec independence activists for decades. According to Peter Graefe at McGill University, federal governments also repeatedly took notice of nationalist success in Quebec.
The Canadian government was also aware that if the Quebec government did all these things for the Francophone majority, that majority would likely come and see Quebec as their one and only government, and would likely make some form of separatism increasingly popular. And so there were moves, too, at the federal level to improve the presence of Francophones in the Canadian Federal Service, to make the use of the French language stronger within the federal government, but also in a number of national institutions. I don't know if it sold a great deal, but it certainly reduced the idea that Canada was in some sort of hostile relationship between the federal government and Quebec.
After the crisis of 1970, Quebec would go on to have 2 referendums over whether it should become an independent country. Both happened peacefully, and both times, people voted no.
I think if you have the ability to continue talking and that conversation is actually productive, it doesn't always have to be amicable. And in some cases, in fact, it's very heated and the people at the table hate each other. But nevertheless, if they feel that they can gain something from talking, then chances are they aren't going to be making use of force. There's a way in which it wears down some of the harder edges.
That's Peter Graefe, a political scientist at McGill University in Montreal, speaking with Lacey Healy for the national security podcast Things That Go Boom. Their reporting on Quebec's October crisis in 1970 also prompted some reflections on what Americans can learn from that period when Canada was gripped by political violence. On this, we give Peter Graefe the last word.
Maybe the lesson a bit out of the October crisis is that it's the people around them. That when there's supportive constituencies, it's easier for those groups to act. But when those people actually see that there's a point in participating in the system or feel their grievances are being dealt with in other ways, those who are pushing more violent solutions are left alone, and that undermines their own self-confidence in the acts that they're taking.
Thanks to our PRX colleagues at Things That Go Boom for sharing their reporting on the FLQ. This story is an excerpt from their episode, What a Tipping Point Looks Like, which just won a Signal Award for podcasting. Hear the full episode and more national security reporting wherever you get your podcasts. Search for Things That Go Boom. Quick pivot now from French-Canadian history to political news in France today. Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu survived 2 votes of no confidence today. Losing either of those votes could have toppled his fragile new government and plunged France even deeper into political chaos. But having won, Lecornu has an even bigger challenge ahead, getting a 2026 budget passed by the bitterly divided French parliament before the end of the year. Lecornu is probably getting used to this kind of thing. He was previously prime minister for less than a month before resigning on October 6th. French President Emmanuel Macron reappointed Lecornu on Friday, leading to today's votes. Never a slow news day in Paris. The World is a co-production of GBH and PRX, broadcasting weekdays from the Nan and Bill Harris studio. I'm Carolyn Beeler. Thank you for listening. Come back tomorrow for more.
The World is supported by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people. From the Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. By the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. macfound.org. By the PRX Ambassador Council, whose members include Jake Shapiro and Elizabeth Hansen, Jamel and Tom Perkins, John and Jill Gilbert, Lynn Brody, and Stephanie Gardner. The World's theme music is composed by Ned Porter. The World is a co-production of GBH Boston and PRX.